You are under arrest.
Imagine this. You've done nothing wrong, but one day you're accused of a crime you didn't commit. You can't believe it. You've heard of justice systems where lawyers defend the innocent, where a fair trial is guaranteed. But in medieval times, that wasn't the case. There were no lawyers to fight your case, no guarantees of a fair trial, and no innocent until proven guilty. In fact, the justice system was brutal, unfair, and terrifying. Your life could be decided by something as simple as your social status or your ability to survive a trial by ordeal. Now, let's take a deep dive into medieval justice and see how it all unfolded and just how dangerous it really was to live in a time when survival often meant navigating a terrifying system of laws. A world of fear. Medieval justice wasn't about fairness. It was about power and survival. Imagine being accused of a crime in a society where the concept of justice was in the hands of the elite. If you were a noble, you might have had a shot at a decent defense, but if you were a common peasant, you were at the mercy of a brutal system. You would rely on the whims of the local lord or the biases of the clergy who often had their own interests to protect. Fear, superstition, and power. The medieval period also witnessed a rise in witch trials, especially in the later centuries. Accusations of witchcraft were taken very seriously, and anyone believed to have powers or knowledge of magic was often tortured and executed. These trials were deeply tied to superstition and fear. If you were a woman living during this time, you could be accused of witchcraft for something as simple as being different or not conforming to societal norms. Many innocent women were executed because of these fears, and they remain one of the darkest aspects, proving innocence through pain. One of the most horrifying aspects of medieval justice was the trial by ordeal. If you were accused of a crime, your innocence wasn't determined by evidence or a fair trial. No. You would have to prove yourself through pain and suffering. Picture this. You might be forced to walk across burning coals, plunge your hand into boiling water, or even endure being submerged underwater. If you were injured or died, it was seen as a sign of guilt. But if you miraculously survived, it was believed that God had protected you, proving your innocence. The more extreme the pain, the more proof it was considered, fighting for your life. If the ordeal didn't kill you, the next option was trial by combat. This wasn't a fair trial. This was a fight for your life. In the eyes of the law, the one who won the duel was the innocent party. You might not have been a skilled fighter, but if your opponent was the one who fell, the law saw it as proof of your righteousness. It didn't matter that you were outmatched or lacked any combat skills. Victory meant survival. For the nobility, this was a chance to settle disputes. But for common people, it meant you could be forced to defend yourself in a brutal life-or-death battle, often with little to no training. Laws based on faith, not reason. In medieval Europe, the church had a huge influence on the justice system. Laws were often based on religious scripture, not logic or reason. This meant that decisions were often swayed by the church's interpretation of the Bible, and many crimes were judged based on the morality of the accused rather than the facts. The church could even manipulate laws to protect its own interests, often shielding clergy from punishment, no matter the severity of their crimes. If a priest were accused of a crime, he was likely to receive a far less severe punishment than a common person. The religious nature of medieval law blurred the lines between justice and dogma, cruel, unforgiving, and often deadly. If you were found guilty of a crime, the punishment was often brutal. Theft, murder, and treason could lead to a death sentence. The punishment wasn't just about execution, it was about making an example out of you. Hanging, burning at the stake, and being drawn and quartered were just some of the horrifying fates that awaited those who were accused of serious crimes. But it didn't end there. If you were caught committing petty crimes, you could be humiliated in public stocks or pillories, branded or thrown into a filthy prison where many died from disease or starvation. In some cases, criminals were tortured to confess, making their ordeal even more painful. Special rights and immunity. But what if you were rich or a noble? Would justice be on your side then? In many ways, yes. The nobility had special privileges under medieval law. They were less likely to be punished severely, and in some cases, they were immune to certain punishments. This stark divide between the rich and poor made the justice system even more unfair, as the wealthy could avoid the most extreme consequences of their actions. For example, while a peasant might be executed for a crime like theft, a noble might simply be fined or have the case dismissed altogether. The law was often two-faced, and the higher your status, the more power you had over your own fate. Powerless and expendable. And then there were the serfs, people tied to the land and subject to the will of their lords. Serfs had no power, no rights, and no say in matters of justice. If a lord accused you of something, you were likely to suffer the consequences, whether you were guilty or not. Serfs had no access to the legal protections that even some common folk might get, and they could be punished by their lord for the slightest offenses with no recourse. They were powerless and expendable, often treated as mere property rather than individuals with rights. The harshest of trials. Criminals in the Middle Ages weren't always given a chance to defend themselves or face a fair trial. Many accused of crimes were immediately thrown into dungeons where they could face harsh treatment and often died from the terrible conditions. If you were a criminal who survived the prison system, your fate could still be brutal. The common punishments for criminals included flogging, cutting off body parts like hands or ears, or even being branded with hot iron. For the most serious crimes like treason or murder, the public execution was a common spectacle, a form of punishment meant to scare the population into submission. The role of the juries and the Lord's Court medieval justice wasn't always just about trials by ordeal or combat. In some cases, accused individuals were judged by a group of peers, or what was known as a jury. However, this wasn't a jury in the sense we think of today. These were local villagers or townsfolk who often had little to no formal training in law. They might know the accused personally, making it easy for personal biases to affect their decision-making. Furthermore, most of these trials took place in a lord's court, where the lord had the final say in any case. The accused didn't always stand a fair chance in these trials, especially if the lord had a vested interest in the outcome. Living in medieval times was a gamble with your life, and in many cases, that gamble didn't pay off. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey through the medieval justice system. If you found this fascinating, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next week for more explorations into the medieval world.